俺相撲得意だかんなよー
Hello everyone, Skippy here, and welcome to One Piece episode 904, an episode featuring the return of some pretty strong staff members in form of Masayuki Takagi and Masahiro Hosoda. Takagi is a supervisor that's been working on the anime for about as long as Hisada and Yokoyama, starting with episode 4 and going on to become an extremely respected supervisor in the eyes of the staff, supervising some of the biggest episodes on the anime like episode 480 and 850, which both showcase his punchy art that manages to be both round and angular at the same time, with cartoony character art that plays with extreme angles and exaggeration coupled together with really cool shading. As far as Hosoda is concerned though, he didn't join the anime as a regular episode director until around the end of the Punk Hazard arc with episode 608, and despite having a bit of a rocky start for the majority of the Dressrosa arc, with episodes like 697 that slogged through its source material and created a very confused overall atmosphere, he started improving majorly in the Whole Cake Island arc, directing episodes like 816 that show off just how much he likes to use Tokoro's method of using scale in fun ways to make the characters feel more ingrained with their environments, taking full advantage of an episode setting and therefore creating an appropriate atmosphere for it. So with a supervisor that's known for peppering episodes with his stylish art, and an episode director that will surely play around with Bakura Town and the rest of the areas present, this should absolutely be a memorable episode, especially when considering that Hosoda's last episode on the anime was episode 886, and that Takagi has been off the anime for quite a while now, working as an animation supervisor on One Piece Stampede. But with the content that this episode seems to be covering presenting quite a few challenges in regards to stretching it out, we may end up getting a bit of a nothing episode, like what was on show last week. So can Takagi and Hosoda manage to use their skills to their fullest extent and deliver a noteworthy episode based on content that acts like a prelude to the end of the Bakura Town escapades? Well, let's gallop along with this breakdown and find out. This episode covered the last 5 pages of Chapter 916 and the first 6 pages of Chapter 917, and despite a few small bits of filler action and Hold'em stuff, the episode itself follows the events of the original chapters pretty closely, despite taking the liberty to rearrange a good amount of scenes in order to make the episode as a whole flow a lot better. In the manga, there's a lot of really random quick cuts to different places and scenery at very awkward times, and the anime does a pretty good job at changing where it cuts in order to make it really mesh more. However, due to the episode overall having a pretty short page count, that means that it falls into the same pitfalls as last week, where there's a whole lot of padding and milking of scenes that don't deserve it at all. Like a good amount of the Hold'em confrontation, for example, constantly cutting away from and back to the same 5 shots while Hold'em laughs and Tama squeals. So while there is definitely an actual effort to adapt the manga chapters into an anime episode, it's bogged down by having to resort to once again padding out events that don't need as much time in the limelight. So while I definitely will commend Hosoda and co for not just doing a one-for-one adaptation of the source material, it ends up being quickly forgotten once the second half decides to slog through the remaining content. It's certainly not Hosoda's fault that he was given such difficult content to adapt, but it nonetheless brings the episode down adaptation-wise, especially since Hosoda's storyboard here is actually pretty damn standard for him, using the cool compositing to his advantage like most other episode directors, but it doesn't really feature enough noteworthy shots to justify spending a whole section covering it this week. It gets the job done, absolutely, but I feel like I'd really just be wasting my time trying to figure out something to say about a storyboard that is more full of Nagamine highlights with the several eye shots rather than any highlights from the actual episode director. So with that said, let's trottle on to the highlights section and see what we've got going on in that neck of the woods and see if it brings this episode's quality up a fair bit. Despite the episode proper being supervised by Masayuki Takagi, with his cartoony and highly exaggerated art being featured throughout the episode, it's actually the supervisor of episode 902, Masahiro Kitazaki, that sits at the top of the key animators list this week, with the most interesting bit of key animation from him being Okiku's initial attack, which features some super weighty and satisfying movement coupled together with some really nice rhythmic timing and effects work. It's not really an absurdly long scene as I've already mentioned, but it was nice enough in its execution that I feel like it's worth mentioning. With that carrying over to the other animation highlight that we have this week, coming to us all the way from Toei Philippines with Dennis Cablo's Hold'em cut. While once again very short, Cablo manages to pack this scene of Hold'em lifting up Urashima with a surprising amount of movement, conveying the heft of the scene really well, and when coupled together with Cablo's cool effects work that find a middleman between classic and modern effects, this rather insignificant scene is turned into something noteworthy. Cablo is one of the shining talents over at Toei Phils, and while he hasn't been as active on One Piece as of late, I hope he can manage to pop up a lot more frequently in the near future to give his impressive style to scenes more deserving of it. And with those two cuts, we've basically covered all the noteworthy animation in this episode, with the nature of the content itself and the fact that this episode seems to be rushed a bit playing a huge role in why that's the case. Naturally, when you have another supervisor being the top credited key animator on another supervisor's episode, chances are that that episode was rushed a bit. So what we're dealing with here is an episode that not only suffers because of the limiting material that it's covering, but one that also suffers because it's a rushed episode that covers some of the most unexciting content that this arc has brought us so far. So what we're left with is an overall unremarkable episode that does have its highlights, sure, but it's also one that leaves me struggling in regards to finding stuff to talk about. It's certainly not dreadful like last week's episode, don't get me wrong, but when the content itself is so sparse and uninteresting, I can't really say that I feel much for this episode. I can only hope that Tasuku Shimaya and Masahiro Shimanuki's episode next week will manage to bring us some relief since it's covering content that is tons more exciting, but after the last few weeks have been a bit meh on the whole, I'm certainly keeping my expectations fairly low. Anyways guys, that's it for now. I'm Skippy, and since I'm sure I'll be asked about it, the Romance Dawn special airing in just a few weeks does indeed look pretty damn good.